I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, as always, Connor Rebush of BloodyElbow.com, and with me is Bleacher Report's esteemed fight analyst, Patrick Wyman. And Pat, we have a fantastic card ahead of us. UFC 192 is stacked from top to bottom. Not a single fight on this card doesn't look enjoyable in one sense or the other to me. Most of them are both relevant and entertaining, and even the ones that I don't expect to be that fun to watch, at least have a lot of meaning for their respective divisions. So it's a card that I personally cannot wait to watch, and we are going to look at it in depth for the majority of today's episode. But before that, we have an issue to address, Patrick.
We do have an issue. My God, do we have an issue.
Some of you out there may have noticed that following a knockout of a certain Mr. Musashi by a certain Mr. Hall at UFC Japan last weekend, Patrick and I got into a sometimes heated debate on social media and in the comments section of my own Bloody Elbow article about the kick, discussing whether or not it was a fluke or a lucky shot. And as you probably all guessed, Pat and I both decided that it's for the best for him to leave the show. We both agreed when he started here that I would brook no disagreements whatsoever in public. It's pretty much the end of both our working relationship and our friendship, though we will speak courteously to each other in public if other people are around.
Yeah, but only if other people are around. Yeah. Otherwise, it's daggerish glares and liver shots. That's I think that's where we came down on it. Yeah,
I can take the liver shots. It's the glares that hurt.
Yeah, really. I mean, well, liver shots hurt too, but that pain passes, Connor. That pain passes, my friend.
The glare stays with you. That lingers in the memory.
Yeah,
the liver shot just lingers in the urine.
Yeah. and maybe you throw a little lacerated spleen in there too. I don't know if there'll be time. But as kind of a general thing, we were talking about this before we went on the air, but like neither you nor I take arguments personally because we pretty much argue professionally, right? Like, and this is going to be something that we delve into as we discuss this topic and we explore the ways in which we disagree and why that's kind of a meaningful thing. Like we argue professionally. It's not a bad thing if we disagree with each other because, we're in the business of making predictions and you're going to be wrong a lot of the time. And that's just fine. Like the best fight pickers in the world are somewhere around 70%, right? And, so that means you're still going to be wrong 30% of the time. And you have to be okay with that. The only crime in being wrong is in learning nothing from it and not trying to figure out exactly where you went wrong.
Right. Perfectly agreed. For those who aren't keyed in, do you want to give them the rundown of what our disagreement was?
Yeah, our disagreement basically revolves around whether Uriah Hall's spinning back kick to the face on Gegard Mousasi was a lucky shot or not, or whether it was fluky. And so there are some debates here as to terminology, and I'm willing to concede a couple of points to start with. At first, I kind of doubted that that Hall aimed at the head intentionally. After looking at it again a number of times, I think that, yeah, he actually was aiming at the head. Second, as to what the meaning of fluke is, I just think of a fluke as an incredibly improbable event. I don't think that there's anything implied in there about intentionality. I realize that that's not the way that other people read that, and so for the sake of argument, I'm willing to discard the term fluke. For me, it's just a synonym for an incredibly improbable event. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you meant to do it or not. Like if you chuck up a shot on a basketball court from all the way under the other hoop and it goes in, I would say that that's a fluke even though you were aiming at the hoop. Like you meant to make it, but that's still fluky to me.
And for you, really, a lot of the root of the disagreement is that for you, a fluke generally denotes a low percentage or an unlikely, an attack with an unlikely or a low success rate. It's unlikely to succeed. And if we were to just use that as the term, if we were to say it's a low percentage strike or, whatnot, then absolutely. Was Uriah Hall very lucky to have that kick land exactly as it did? No doubt. Absolutely. A lucky man indeed, especially considering the way that fight was going, aside from that brief, I don't know, he had maybe, 15 seconds on the feet in the entire fight?
Yeah, if that. I mean, I think he was down inside of 10 seconds in the first round, and he landed that kick at like 4:56 of the second round.
Yeah, it was like 7 seconds in, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he had so little time. So that to me is what speaks to this being not just a low percentage shot, right? Because it's a sliding scale. There's, in terms of MMA strikes landed, a leg kick is a high percentage shot. A body kick is a high percentage shot.
A jab.
A jab, yeah, more or less. A jab is a relatively high percentage shot. A flying knee or a high kick is a low percentage shot. A spinning back kick to the body, I think, is a relatively low percentage shot. I think those land at a higher rate than head kicks or flying knees. I would need to dig into the data to be sure, but anecdotally, that would be my impression. A jumping, spinning back kick to the head doesn't even belong in the same category as those other shots as low percentage. It's so low as to be non-existent, and to the point that we don't even see people throw them.
Do you agree with me that there is a sort of a sliding scale, or maybe two ways to categorize what makes a shot low percentage, or a technique low percentage? I think I said in my article that there are low percentage techniques that are low percentage because they eschew certain fundamentals that allow other techniques to be consistently effective. I think the example I used was a bulldog choke, which is less commonly successful than a rear naked choke, despite the fact that both use the exact same grip, for obvious reasons. The bulldog choke eschews the control of the hooks or the body triangle. While you can still get some measure of control out of it, you also sometimes give up your back. And you would say the same thing about, I don't know, what's another technique that's kind of a cheat technique? Like it skips necessary steps, like Sakuraba's Kimura, for example. His Kimura body lock counter. That's a kind of thing where it skips certain steps that other submission attacks would require.
Yeah, a straight up lift and slam from double underhooks.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
That's a low percentage technique. So, I mean, the point with techniques like that is that under normal circumstances, they have a very low percentage chance of working. So low as to be basically to the point of being equivalent to our jumping spinning back kick to the head.
Sure.
Right. But there are certain contexts in which the chances of those techniques working improves drastically. So a bulldog choke has a much higher chance of working when your opponent is hurt or in a scramble, right? If you just come around to the side and try and grab a bulldog choke, chances are it's not going to work. But if your opponent's hurt and they give up their neck and you get your grip in and suddenly you're applying the choke and you're let's say Uriah Faber on Francisco Rivera, that has a much higher chance of working right away because your grip is already sunk in. The problem with the bulldog choke isn't so much the lack of leverage, it's that getting to that point when your opponent knows what you're trying to do, they have so many options for escaping. Or I'm trying to think of a good striking example, but like a flying knee is another great one. Like a flying knee, if your opponent knows it's coming and you're just circling at range, a flying knee has almost no chance of working. That's why when you see people throw flying knees, it's generally with their opponent backed up to the fence. It's when their opponent's ducking. They find a way to induce their opponent to duck down. Or as with Tomas Almeida versus Brad Pickett, Almeida grabbed the back of Pickett's head and pulled his head down into the knee. Like he had like kind of a single collar tie, and it helped that Pickett was already kind of ducking a little bit.
Sure. I think maybe we could call like a lead uppercut of relatively low percentage strike. That is low percentage for the same reasons as a bulldog choke. Lead uppercut, yeah. It's not a good idea to throw one for many reasons, generally speaking. But sometimes the fact that it's unwise can make it very difficult to predict, and sometimes that is in your favor. If the timing is right or the angle is right or the opponent is compromised in some way, as you hinted. On the other end of the spectrum there, Pat, I think are techniques that are low percentage because they take a high degree of skill to pull off. And so there we have techniques like, let's say an omoplata. Very low percentage in MMA. Ben Saunders very recently hit the first one ever to take place in the octagon, which just shows you, and that's every fight going back to 1993, so that shows you how difficult they are to hit at high levels. But it's not because they don't work. They're actually very successful techniques. A lot of jiu-jitsu practitioners specialize in them, and in fact, they're very successful for the same reason that Kimuras are, that they can work even when they don't work. Kind of like a jab. Your jab doesn't have to land to elicit an reaction from your opponent. Omoplata is a great hold to go for if you're trying to sweep the opponent. You can abandon the submission and take top position when they're forced to roll over to save their shoulder. But
like Donald Cerrone versus Miles Jury,
yes,
used a low percentage technique in the omoplata to get himself to the positions that he wanted to be in for almost, the entire first round of that fight, if memory serves. And then didn't he use it again in the second?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but so we see it. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And that's more like the jumping spinning back kick, right? Most people who try a jumping spinning back kick are going to have a terribly low success rate. There are others who would have a higher success rate. Now, I will say, I think Uriah Hall is at the high end of that spectrum. If there's a type of guy who I would expect to land that technique with a relatively high success rate, and it's still low, then he's definitely on that list. But it does start to become a little more fluky when you consider how little time he had to really measure and set up that strike. You give a guy 15 seconds on the feet against Gegard Mousasi total. So that's 7 seconds to the start of one round. He didn't really have time to figure out what Mousasi's reactions were going to be. Now, I do think Hall is probably the kind of guy who studies his opponents. He seems like a very cerebral fighter, and so it's not at all unlikely that he saw Mousasi fighting, watched his footage, saw that Mousasi has a very clear tendency to duck his head, he bends his back and leans forward, he exposes his chin to upward strikes and to linear low strikes, and so he may have very well seen that was an opening, but the fact that he got Mousasi to make that reaction at that exact moment was pretty damn lucky, because he didn't really do anything to concretely establish a different threat to get his head in that position. He just kind of hoped that he would flinch when he saw the big spin and react incorrectly.
Yeah. And that to me is what makes this such a in my mind, a low percentage shot as to be fluky, is that so many things had to happen here that were entirely out of Uriah Hall's control for that strike to land the way that it did. To land, not just to land, but to land cleanly and hurt Mousasi to the extent that Hall could follow up. Like, the flying knee that Hall followed up with, it was not a fluky shot at all. That was the perfect shot to throw when your opponent is hurt, bending down but still on their feet, and moving on a straight line. A flying knee is exactly the shot that you want to throw there. Like, so there's absolutely nothing fluky about the follow-up or the finish. The shot that started it, that's if a fluke is something that's so impossibly low percentage, as to be almost zero, like then that to me was a fluky shot. Because, like, in terms of my overall viewpoint about life in general, but fights in particular, I live in a probabilistic world, and what I'm trying to do is understand the likeliest outcomes to make the soundest predictions over a large sample. When you predict, 400 and something fights over the course of a year, when you watch that many, you can't look at everything as every single one as a discrete event, and you need to try and figure out the underlying principles there. So the way that I do that is thinking about things probabilistically, in the same way that advanced baseball analysts look at large samples of data. In the same way that advanced metrics have redefined basketball in the last decade. That's the way that I try to look at and understand fights. And so, to me, talking about a particular outcome or an event within a fight, i.e., Uriah Hall's spinning back kick or jumping spinning back kick to the face, like, to call that lucky or to call that fluky, that's not an insult to me. It's just an incredibly low probability event. Like, now Uriah Hall, of all people, is the favorite to land that technique. Like, I would say either Uriah Hall, James Muntasri, or Paul Felder would be my three choices of a guy to land that shot on an oncoming opponent. So yeah, if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be one of those three guys. It's like there's a baseball player named Ben Revere who had gone through some thousands of at bats without hitting a home run. Ben Revere finally hit a home run. Like, that's an incredibly low probability outcome for that given at bat. But, good for Ben Revere for doing it. Now, like, when, say, Giancarlo Stanton hits a home run, probably the single most powerful home run hitter in baseball, like, a home run for him is not as improbable an event. it's still an improbable event in the grand scheme of things. It's not the favorite for that to be the outcome in any individual at bat. But these things happen at relatively predictable rates over large enough sample sizes.
Sure.
That's why you use that you have big rate statistics, things like home run to fly ball rate in baseball, batting average on balls in play, that given a large enough sample size will play out at predictable rates. There's still some variance in there, even over large samples, but they happen at relatively predictable rates. And I think of jumping, spinning back kicks in the same way. They're like, at some point, somebody was going to jumping, spinning back kick somebody in the face in a UFC fight, and it was probably going to be somebody who was really good at those things.
Sure, and we know Uriah Hall likes that kick. We've got footage of him using it in training. He's attempted it in fights before. He often does throw it to the body. In fact, he's used it as a takedown counter in the past. So yeah, it's not something that we have any reason to suspect Hall of. It's not like Travis Brown going in and spinning back kicking someone in the face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or even like Fabricio Verdum, like wheel kicking somebody in the face. Like,
and we know he likes to do that, but even so, like the level of skill there is obviously very different.
Yeah, and so and if you look at the way that Hall throws it, he throws it impeccably. It is a beautiful strike because the key to throwing a spinning back kick is to turn and locate your target over your shoulder. Like that is the key to landing a spinning strike. You don't close your eyes, spin, and hope that you land it. You try and spot and adjust. You try and spot over your shoulder as you complete the spin and extend your leg. Like you try and spot your target as you do that. And Hall does that, and that's when he adjusts to the proper angle.
He's one of the few guys I know to accurately and regularly use the traditional back kick variety too, the mule kick, rather than a turning side kick, which is what we more commonly see. I think more guys are more comfortable chambering their knee high and letting the side kick go. I think it's just a more natural motion. The mule kick, shooting it out with the knee low and extending your leg straight back, very powerful, very difficult and uncomfortable to land with accuracy if you're not used to it. It's a really awkward strike to learn. And so, I definitely admire Hall's dexterity and the amount of hours he's put in perfecting that specific strike. But I think overall, we can wash our hands of this issue. Pat, you'll be moving on to better things.
I mean, I think you have to give the man credit for landing the strike, and I think that there's that when you think about things probabilistically, talking about a given outcome as the result of luck is not derisive. It's like that's just a thing that can happen sometimes, and you mark it and you think, oh wow, that was pretty fucking cool. And then you think, okay, but we're almost certainly not going to see that again for a very, very long time. It would be an incredibly improbable thing for somebody to jumping, turning, spinning back kick somebody in the face again in the near future, even for Uriah Hall to do that.
Right. It still requires skill, obviously, because luck influences all things in fighting and in athletics in general. But luck influences some things more than others. And I think that's really the crux of our discussion, and we can both agree on that. Moving on to UFC 192, however, we're going to talk about the title fight, the quote-unquote title fight that's taking place. Yeah, I went there. We'll be talking about that next segment. But first of all, I thought since, Pat, you and I are both doing previews now, I'm slowly making tweaks to your format over at SureDog. I added in some special selections where I try and basically pick what's going to be the fight of the night, what's going to be the what I call the smoke break fight of the evening, time to step outside and walk away and maybe go to the bathroom. And I try to pick basically based on... I love betting odds, even though I don't really bet. I love the way that you can kind of examine, and they also influence your thinking too, right? Mm-hmm. You look at betting odds, you're like, that's wider than it should be, but that doesn't mean that one person's more likely to win than they actually are. And there are a lot of lines like that on this card that are very tricky, a lot of really closely matched fights. But anyway, since we're both doing previews now, you for Bleacher Report, me for SureDog, I thought we would just run through really quickly from top to bottom and fight by fight, give our picks, and then as we move on later into the show, we will discuss in depth the ones that we find most interesting, starting, of course, with the title bout. So let's start with, and they've changed the bout order up right now, but looking at the UFC's website, it appears that the first fight of the evening on Fight Pass is now Derek Lewis versus Victor Pesta. What's your pick for that fight?
I like Pesta by decision. I think that he's super durable, and if he can weather kind of the early storm, eventually get Lewis down, he can kind of grind him out. Pesta by decision.
Is there some kind of pun, some kind of Chuck Testa pun in calling Victor Pesta Czech Pesta?
I'll look, my entire memory of Victor Pesta as a fighter, aside from what I saw reviewing him for this fight, is in the corner of his last fight when he's gotten blasted by Konstantin Yarokhin, and I think it's Andreas Michael in his corner says, "You're a takedown machine. What are you?" Takedown machine.
Takedown machine. Yeah, one of the greatest corner quotes. Almost that's like a Clay Guida burp in terms of legendary status right there. I definitely.
I looked so hard for the vine of that, and I can't find it, and it's just breaking my heart. All I want is to see the vine of Victor Pesta say, "Takedown machine."
I like Victor Pesta as well. I think a late knockout is probably more likely than the decision. I don't see Derek Lewis making it to the third round without getting hurt. Pesta's got some considerable power in his hands. I was actually surprised. I did not remember his bout with Ruslan Magomedov, who fights later on this card. I didn't remember it as being as competitive as it was, but he actually had Magomedov very badly hurt in that fight a couple times. So he's got respectable crack in his hands. He weighs 265 pounds, 242 pounds, but that's what happens when you're that big. You hit people, it hurts them. Moving on to the next bout of the night, Chris Carriasso versus Sergio Pettis. Bout between wayward flyweight fringe contenders. What's your pick here?
I like Pettis here. I think that this is very clearly like a get back on track matchup for Pettis against a guy who's going to be willing to fight his kind of fight. But Pettis just throws so much more volume. He's every bit as skilled. His problem is that he can't take a shot, and Carriasso isn't the kind of guy who's going to challenge him in that regard at all. Like, it wouldn't surprise me to see Pettis take him down and work from the top either. I think that Pettis is basically better absolutely everywhere.
And it's not even just that Pettis can't take a shot. He often fights like he knows he can't take a shot. That, to me, is often the bigger problem, right? Because we have guys who have weak chins who fight like they can take any punch in the world, and that confidence works for them. And it surprised me coming from Duke Rufus, who talks so much about the power of positive mental thinking, but that does seem to be a problem with Pettis. If Carriasso had the same power as Ryan Benoit, I might pick him to do what Ryan Benoit did to Pettis and rough him up. I think he's capable of that, but he doesn't crack that hard. He's not that diverse in his attack, so I like Pettis here as well. Next bout of the evening, Francisco Trevino fighting a very hot prospect coming out of Legacy Fighting Championships, Sage Northcutt. I'm going with Northcutt here. I think he'll probably get the stoppage, though Trevino has never been stopped before. What do you say, Pat?
Yeah, I think Northcutt's going to finish him. I mean, when you look at Northcutt on film, he's only 19 years old. He looks like an Abercrombie model. According to my colleague, Jeremy Botter of Bleacher Report, who just sat down and talked with Northcutt the other day, Northcutt has never had a soda in his life, has done like 500 push-ups and sit-ups a day since he was 5 years old. He doesn't spar in training. And, yeah, I mean, he's just like, he's a ridiculous athlete.
I kind of want him to lose now.
I'm sorry?
I kind of want him to lose now.
Because he doesn't spar?
Drink a soda, dude.
Like, that's going to work against Frank Trevino, but that's not going to work forever.
Yeah. Well, I was more thinking about he's never drank a soda. Come on now.
Yeah, he's never drank a soda. He's never eaten sweets. Like, it's a whole family. Like, put it this way: like, something bad is going to happen to Sage Northcutt if he gets a lot of money later in life. Like, you cannot live that kind of life forever and not have something go wrong in your head. But props to him if he doesn't.
One of the highlights of the prelims coming up next: Adriano Martins versus Islam Makhachev. I like Makhachev here. Been very impressed with his game so far. I think he may even be a more well-rounded fighter than guys like Khabib and Abubakar Nurmagomedov, though perhaps not as strong in each area. But his transitional fighting is top-notch. I think you'll have a tough fight with Martins, who is a very dangerous, very powerful striker, solid grappling. But I do think Makhachev will get the decision.
Yeah, what worries me about this fight for Makhachev, and I've been very high on him for a very long time. I first scouted him in December of 2013. Like, what worries me is just Martin's physicality. Mm-hmm. Like, he is so big and so strong. I mean, he would be a good-sized welterweight. I have to imagine he walks around at 190-plus pounds and makes the cut. And Makhachev, I think, could probably fairly easily make featherweight. Like, he is not a big dude.
Yeah, but he uses his size very well.
Yeah, he's incredibly fluid. Once he gets his hands on you, you're never getting away. He's a much better striker than Khabib was at a similar point in his career. He's way more fluid with his hand. He's a much better kicker than any of the other guys to come out of Abdul Manap Nurmagomedov's training facility, which I imagine is just gritty as shit in Dagestan.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I like Makhachev because you can be almost certain that you're going to get a better version of Islam Makhachev in this fight than we saw in May.
Okay, our next fight, moving on to the Fox Sports 1 prelims, we're looking at Angela Hill versus Rose Namajunas. Who's your pick here, Pat?
I like Namajunas. I know we disagree on this, but I think that Namajunas is a better striker. I think that Hill kind of gets by on her athleticism at this point. She trains with a crappy camp. She doesn't really seem to be getting all that much better from fight to fight. I think that Namajunas is just more diverse, a better athlete, matches her physically, matches her for power, and is an infinitely more dangerous grappler on the mat. Like, I don't think that Hill has the slightest idea what she's doing on the floor.
I like Hill here, provided she can keep this fight on the feet. I really have not been that impressed with Rose Namajunas' striking. Well, and no doubt we'll be discussing this one later on in the show. So we'll just leave the deeper discussion for it then. I'm picking Angela Hill. I know it's a weird upset pick. It's not one that I'm completely 100% confident in, of course. It's a closely matched fight, but there it is. Next, moving on to what should be the fight of the night, Alan Jouban takes on Albert Tumenov.
Yeah, I like Tumenov here, but not by as much as the betting odds would indicate. He's a more than 2-1 favorite right now, and I think that this is pretty tough. This is a pretty tough matchup for him. Jouban is a pretty classic pressure fighter, and Tumenov is an out fighter. Like, he is purely the kind of guy who wants to be working from the outside. He wants to stick and move, and he's not the most precise out fighter in the world. Like, he kind of depends on you to respect him and give him space at a certain point. And he's willing to bite down and throw in the pocket, but he's not great at it. He's hittable in the pocket, and Jouban is hellaciously tough and hits real hard.
Mm-hmm. I almost see Jouban as more of a brawler than a pressure fighter, but I absolutely agree with you there. And
he's a swarmer, right?
For sure.
Wouldn't you call him more of a swarmer?
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think Jouban is very, very dangerous. I have a lot of respect for Jouban's game. He's one of my favorite fighters to watch. I think Tumenov just is that little more precise and technical with his striking, but he's also hittable. He uses his angles really well to take the sting off of most of those punches that do land, but he's there to be hit when he does engage in the pocket. So
he's got about like my favorite, maybe one of my 2 or 3 favorite left hooks in MMA.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great high kick game as well. But, Jouban sitting in there in the pocket, very dangerous guy, especially if Jouban manages to wrap him up in the clinch. He's got some very vicious elbows and knees in the clinch that make him, and good uppercuts, short punches, dangerous guy to contest in that range. But both of us are picking Tumenov in that fight. Moving on, we've got featherweights Yair Rodriguez versus Dan Hooker. Pat, who are you picking here?
I again, another one I know where we disagree. I like Yair Rodriguez here. I think he's just an ultra special physical specimen, like a top-notch elite athlete, and getting much better from fight to fight. Like, I like his consistent improvement. With that said, Hooker's super durable. He's tough. He's really experienced. He's got a beautiful straight left now that he's going to southpaw pretty much full time. Great elbows. If Rodriguez isn't paying attention, or he gets kind of lazy, or Hooker just kind of puts everything together, could be a really tough night for him. But I think that Rodriguez is just so much more dynamic and so much more athletic that he finds a way to get it done, whatever that is. Probably a submission. Yeah,
and I actually like Hooker to keep the fight on the feet. I think he's got some really solid defensive grappling, and I like him to swarm Rodriguez and kind of test that inexperience a little bit. Hooker's got a background not only in MMA, but in kickboxing. He's been impressive in both, if not perfectly consistent. He's basically not he has no defense whatsoever, but he is about as tough as they come, and I have yet to see Yair Rodriguez really successfully put together punching combinations like the kind it takes to stave off the assault of a guy like Dan Hooker. And even when you put those combinations together, if anybody saw the beating that Maximo Blanco put on him in their fight, Hooker still came back to probably win the third round of that bout and hurt Blanco several points throughout the fight. He's just a tough man, so I like him over the more inexperienced Rodriguez. Next, we've got Joseph Benavidez versus Ali Bagotinov. We'll try and get through the main card quickly. I know we're going to discuss them more in depth later, so we'll just get our quick picks here for the last 6 fights.
Yeah, I like Benavidez by tight decision here. Just people have forgotten that Ali Bagotinov is actually really, really good.
Yeah.
Benavidez gets it done, but it's a lot closer than the betting odds indicate, again.
Agreed. I favor Benavidez, too, and I think we'll talk about that one later on. Next, we've got first fight of the main card, Jessica Ai versus Juliana Pena.
I like Pena here. Way more physical, way stronger, way aggressive. Everything that gave I have problems against Miesha Tate, but Pena is just that much more physical.
Yep, got to agree with you all the way. Next, we've got Sean Jordan versus Ruslan Magomedov.
Coin flip, but Jordan is just way too hittable. And even though Magomedov is not like the world's most powerful puncher, you don't need to be to hurt Sean Jordan. I think Magomedov lands something big, probably a head kick, and puts him down in the second.
And I'm actually favoring Sean Jordan in this one. I think he'll swarm Magomedov, give him problems, possibly work the ground game. I've not been super impressed with Magomedov so far. I think he's got lots of potential, and he's still very young by heavyweight standards. But Sean Jordan's been there and back again, and I think his experience will count for him in this fight. Next, we've got a light heavyweight pivotal matchup, probably to decide the next title contender in this division, between Ryan Bader and Rashad Evans. On this one, I like Ryan Bader. I think the fight will probably suck. I think the reason for that is, well, look at both of these guys' fights with Phil Davis, and I think you're basically looking at this matchup in a nutshell. Two wrestlers who are perhaps a little more confident in their striking than they have any right to be, whose wrestling games will neutralize one another and force them into a sloppy kickboxing bout. I do think that Bader beats the older and more injury-worn, the shop-worn Rashad Evans, and Bader is just huge compared to Evans, so I've got to favor him.
Yeah, I'm going with Evans here, but this is also my pick for anti-fight of the night for exactly that reason. Neither guy is a high-volume striker. I think there's going to be a lot of kind of grinding in the clinch. I just like Evans to get a little bit more done when he has the opportunity to do so. Like in his last few fights, we've seen Evans throw a lot better combinations. He's strung together 3, 4, 5 shots, and Bader has never done that. So I think that, when the opportunities come, Evans makes more of them and takes like an incredibly tight and incredibly unentertaining decision.
Yeah, that's my smoke break of the night, in case you couldn't tell by our tone. Next, we've got Johnny Hendricks versus Tyron Woodley, almost certainly the number one contenders fight in the welterweight division. Here, yeah. I'll let you go, Pat.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to go with former champion Johnny Hendricks. I think this is a very interesting and close matchup. Two of the strongest guys, probably the two strongest guys in the division here. But frankly, I think this one probably plays out more as a kickboxing bout than a wrestling match. And I think Johnny Hendricks, the volume striking he showed against Robbie Lawler, which was already very successful over 3 rounds, given his newfound appreciation for strength and conditioning and doing his weight cut more intelligently, I think if he can keep that kind of volume up for 3 rounds, he will probably eat Tyron Woodley up.
Yep, Hendricks just throws 3 times as many strikes per minute as Tyron Woodley does, if not even more than that. I mean, this is about volume. Wrestling cancels each other out, and Hendricks has never really had trouble taking a shot. He takes a decision.
Okay, and we will leave our pick for the main event for the start of next segment. We'll be right back after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us. And like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we are back. Pat, Daniel Cormier, Alexander Gustafsson. It is for the UFC title. Both men, I think, agree that John Jones is still the best light heavyweight in the world. But at the very least, this is a guaranteed number one contenders fight, and a one in which both men can justifiably call themselves the world champion. It's one that is rippling with relevance. What are your overall thoughts on the matchup?
Well, I think it's really strange that Alexander Gustafsson is being as badly undersold as he is. It's really strange to me that the kind of default assumption here is that Daniel Cormier is going to run through him, and that suddenly Alexander Gustafsson is just, I guess, not very good. We're talking about a guy whose 3 losses in his career are to Phil Davis when he was young and raw and didn't really know a whole lot about wrestling or grappling, to John Jones, the greatest light heavyweight any of us have ever seen or will ever see, and Anthony Johnson, who is, I think, one of the hardest hitters in light heavyweight history. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and say that Anthony Johnson is the hardest puncher in light heavyweight history and probably the best pressure fighter in light heavyweight history, who is a uniquely, and now we realize this in hindsight, a uniquely bad matchup for Alexander Gustafsson. DC is not those things. And suddenly we're expected to believe on the basis of the minus as high as 4-1 is Daniel Cormier. We're expected to believe that suddenly Alexander Gustafsson is not the guy that we saw blow through pretty much everybody else that he fought in that division with ease. The only guys who have ever even given Gustafsson a fight are those three guys.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're supposed to believe that Cormier is going to blow him out of the water. That seems incredibly strange to me.
I agree. From a promotional perspective, this fight does kind of bug me. We won't get into this too much. I do fear that if Alexander Gustafsson, who at 28 years old is pretty much as close as it gets to a spring chicken in the light heavyweight division, which, like the heavyweight division, is mostly populated with 30-somethings and middle-aged veterans. And so Gustafsson is young. He's full of potential. He's a great athlete. He's already had several periods of marked improvement throughout his career. In fact, I think he looked better than he ever did before in that fight with Anthony Johnson before he got caught. I think his boxing technique, his footwork, he looked really sharp. He was doing a great job of forcing Johnson to turn and keeping him on the end of his punches. I just really polished overall. And then he got clipped and things went downhill. But I think he is still getting better. My fear is that you throw a guy into a title shot against a very dangerous opponent, and while I agree with you that the odds are crazy on this fight, with how wide they are in Cormier's favor, there is absolutely a very realistic chance for Cormier to beat Gustafsson, just as there is the other way. But I think you throw him into that kind of matchup, one in which he's very likely to lose, on the heels of what is undoubtedly the toughest loss of his career, one for which he can't say the judges screwed me or I still have so much to learn, one which happened in front of millions of fans who came only to see him perform and which left him in tears in the octagon. You give him a second loss, and God forbid a crushing one, and you pretty much ruin his career. It takes a very resilient individual to survive that. So from a cultivating talent perspective, I don't like this matchup. I get it, from a we got to make money perspective. Obviously, they're setting up a man to rematch John Jones. Both of these guys had very competitive fights with Jones last time. He'll return, look for his belt. Either one of these would be a great matchup. So no matter who wins, it's not going to be off the heels of a Ryan Bader win, for example. But if Gustafsson loses, I would hate to see such a promising career ended so early.
Yeah, and I think you're right that's effectively where we'd be at. You just have to do this from a promotional perspective because you have to guarantee that John Jones is gonna get a big money rematch in his next fight. You need to be able to sell those highlights. You need to be able to sell the challenger in a redemptive fight for John Jones as somebody who, quote, pushed him to the limit, which would be true for Gustafsson and less true for Cormier. But that's how you have to sell this. And so this is the matchup we get. With all of that said, I think it's going to be fairly surprising that I'm picking Alexander Gustafsson.
And you know what, Pat? So am I. I think both of us are going to shock a lot of people at home. Now, we did mention earlier, I mentioned how much I like looking at fight odds and how they can sometimes influence the way that you pick your fights. So I do fear that seeing Gustafsson as such a huge underdog has influenced my perception of this bout. I say, well, it's a lot closer than that implies. But purely from a technical and strategic standpoint, I think Gustafsson has a lot of the tools to outmaneuver and outbox and just basically out-hustle a guy like Daniel Cormier, who will undoubtedly rely on a pressuring game plan to win, much in the same way he did against John Jones. He wanted to close that gap. He wanted to get inside that long reach. And against Jones, who is not as good a boxer as Gustafsson, we saw that Cormier can do that, but that is not necessarily his natural inclination. Given the choice in the past, the Josh Barnett fight's one of my favorite fights of Cormier's career. I thought both guys looked great, and it was a very entertaining matchup, very technical matchup. And it kind of showed Cormier doing what I think he likes to do best as a striker, which is sort of a Somewhat volume boxer puncher. He likes to move. He likes to mix in high kicks. He likes to be able to draw the other guy in and counter at times. He likes to come in behind his jab. He does not like to have to be pushing forward all the time, constantly. And I think that game plan is bound to fail unless he can make his wrestling work against Alexander Gustafsson. And I have my doubts that he will.
Yeah, I remain completely unsold on Cormier's ability to repeatedly take down Alexander Gustafsson, who is one of the very best defensive wrestlers that we've ever seen in the octagon. I mean, he was the first guy to take down John Jones. Granted, Jones was not coming in off his best training camp ever, but
nor was he expecting to be taken down.
Yeah, it's like he is an exceptional defensive wrestler, and made much more so by his default mode of fighting. He likes to circle, he likes to cut angles, he likes to maneuver at range. It's very, very difficult to get a clean shot at Alexander Gustafsson's hips.
Yeah.
He stops most takedown attempts before they even get to that point because he forces you to shoot from a little too far away. The threat of his uppercuts, the threat of having to stay on the end of his shots forces you to shoot from a couple inches out from further out than where you're really comfortable. And he immediately digs for underhooks and just shoves you off. It's very hard to get in on him, and I'm not sold that Cormier can do that repeatedly.
And what I really like about Gustafsson's game is that offensive wrestling. I think that is actually a very instrumental part of his defensive wrestling, because Gustafsson's an outfighter, right, through and through. I think we both agree on that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And
as pure an example of the archetype as you're ever going to see in MMA.
Absolutely. Which isn't to say that you can't crack. I think he's got more power than most people think. He's got a pretty heavy right hand. He's got a decent left hook, too. But he is mostly an outfighter. He doesn't like to be exchanging in the pocket if he can avoid it. He likes to move. He likes to turn you. Likes to keep you on the end of his punches and have that advantage from long range. And the thing that always worries me with outfighters in MMA is that because the clinch is not a resting place in MMA the way it often is in boxing, outfighters become too limited, which is why I don't think we see many very effective outfighters. Because for a boxer, an outsider has to be able to be all the way in or all the way out, which means sometimes when the other guy's chasing you, you realize, I'm not going to be able to get away, so I'm going to step in and smother him. A lot of outfighters are outfighters because they don't want to be taken down. And so then that gives them problems, right? Because they are engaging with the guy who very likely wants to grapple with them. And so I think it's a really instrumental aspect of Gustafsson's game that he is happy to step forward and put his opponent on the canvas. And he does so very well. He's got a very kind of strange takedown game where he hits what I've heard called a high double leg. He uses his height effectively, so he'll use his head under his opponent's armpit against their ribs to lever them over while getting a very... What's that?
Yeah, he does a really excellent job of turning the corner, using his leg to create a table, and then using the head pressure, using his head pressure to dump his opponent over the leg.
Yeah, he has virtually no shot to speak of because of his height, but he finishes really well.
Yeah, it's really reminiscent. I'm sure he learned it from Phil Davis. It's a takedown that Phil Davis has hit a lot.
Very interesting.
He hits that takedown almost the way that a lot of Sambo fighters do.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. Because we talked about Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov's type, his style of high double leg, where he'll put the forehead in the upper chest of the opponent and just kind of reach down and pick their legs up and run them over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't require you to take a full shot because, again, in Sambo, where you see a lot of uppercuts, it can be very dangerous to get timed with that shot. It's one of the reasons, like, Ali Bagautinov is such a vicious puncher, is he learned that one hitter quitter uppercut on the charging opponent from being a world champion Sambo player. But yeah, so it's a very MMA adapted preferred takedown that Gustafsson likes.
Yeah.
But he's really outstanding. I think he may be the best in the division aside from Jones and maybe Cormier at escaping the clinch. When you get your hands on him, he does a really good job of firing off one knee, then immediately framing to create space, pushing off, and then angling out. He's got great footwork in the clinch.
Yes. Yeah. Now that tendency to step in and smother, which most outfighters can't do, gives him a lot of options. He didn't do it perfectly effectively. Like when a guy's really pressuring with punches, we saw that in the Anthony Johnson fight. He really struggled to. Had Gustafsson stepped in and tried to take Johnson down, or wrap him up in a clinch, he probably could have survived that flurry in the first round.
Yep.
Instead, he stayed right on the end of Johnson's punches. Johnson stiff-armed him, made it a little more difficult to get in, and he was hurt, so his head wasn't clear. But for the most part, I think Gustafsson does a great job of doing what I consider to be a sort of tenet of good technical outfighting, which is just changes of direction, where he'll move right and left. He'll move forward and backward, and he will switch up when you least expect it. And he will feint those direction changes and then move the opposite direction, or feint it and then go that direction. He will constantly force you to adapt to where he's moving, which makes it very difficult to get your feet set either to hit him or, as we already mentioned, to take him down. If you want a very clear example of that at work, you should go back and watch his fight with Matt Hamill, where Hamill just could not get in on a takedown for the life of him. And there are a lot of really clear examples of Hamill feeling forced to shoot from way too far away. And that's a really clear example because obviously guys like Jones, guys like, what are their takedown artists? Guys like Phil Davis. These guys are better at stringing their strikes together and diving in on takedown attempts aggressively than Hamill. But it gives you a very clear picture of how difficult it is to feel confident in a takedown attempt when you are constantly being forced to readjust to just keep the guy in front of you. Not to mention close the distance.
Yeah, it makes it very difficult. And it's made doubly difficult by the fact that Gustafsson throws a lot of strikes aimed at disincentivizing you from changing levels. Gustafsson really excels. If you try and bull rush your way in on him, he has an excellent double collar tie, a really, really outstanding double collar tie, and a very strong one where he uses his long arms, he uses his leverage to keep your hips away from his as he grabs that. So he'll grab the double collar tie, really lock himself together, throw two sharp knees, then use his elbows to push off, create space, frame, and get out. Like, he doesn't want to be in the clinch for any longer than he needs to be, but he's adept at using it as a tactical solution to the problem of getting smothered.
Absolutely. Now my question is, because obviously Cormier, and Cormier is, I don't want to give the impression that I think Cormier is completely outmatched as a striker. He's a very capable kickboxer. We've seen that in a lot of his fights. He moves much better than you would expect him to, given his build. He's throws combinations better than most. He puts kicks after his punches. He kicks low and high. He attacks the body. He's good at all those things. So he will probably feel compelled to fight a certain way against Gustafsson. That's why he's limited, but he won't be completely outmatched. My question is, will his wrestling be as ineffective as John Jones' wrestling was against Gustafsson? Because I think a lot of the problems that Jones had were going over and over for the same sort of pick-up double leg from the fence, not setting up his takedowns effectively, and Cormier has a very different takedown game. Cormier likes the body lock takedowns. He likes the high C lifts. He's not a double leg artist. He likes sometimes single legs. He'll hit trips from the clinch, but he's not the kind of I can sprawl on you and just circle away and stuff your takedowns every time kind of wrestler.
Yeah, Cormier is an extraordinary chain wrestler.
Yes.
And is really at his best. I don't think Cormier is even at his best as a wrestler when he's hitting takedowns so much as he is grinding you in the intervening spaces. Like, I think that Cormier has the best front headlock game in wrestling terms in that division.
God forbid you try to take him down.
Yeah, I think he's got the very best duck under. I think he does a really excellent job of forcing guys into positions that they're not used to being in an MMA fight. I think the front headlock being a good example, and that duck under to the ride against the fence is another. We saw him use that extensively, especially early against Anthony Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Cormier is going to need to force Gustafsson to fight in those spaces. And the key to this matchup for me is whether Gustafsson can walk the kind of tightrope that he did so effectively for like 3.5 rounds against John Jones. Because to win that fight, he had to make that fight competitive, he had to keep it at a very particular slice of range. He couldn't be out at kicking distance, and he couldn't be all the way into the clinch where Jones wanted to be. He needed to keep that at his boxing range to be effective.
One short step away from a clean jab at pretty much all times.
Yeah, but not so far out that he was comfortably within Jones's kicking range and only Jones's kicking range.
Where if Jones kicked him, he could step in and counter or work to take him down.
It's a real tightrope walk, and what makes me pick Gustafsson here was his ability to do that against John Jones. If you can do it against John Jones, where you have such a tiny margin for error, I think Gustafsson has a lot bigger margin for error here against Daniel Cormier, where he can still win the fight. I also think, like, Cormier as a striker does an insanely good job of maximizing his length. He's not a long guy at all. He's really short, stockily built, but he explodes into his jab. He throws a lot of kicks. When he throws hooks, he throws a lot of Russian style hooks, like casting hooks, that extend his reach even further. He fights surprisingly long for such a short guy.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's always stood out to me about Cormier. I think I remember former Bloody Elbow writer Coach Mike Reardon saying that Cormier as a wrestler never wrestled like a short guy. He didn't wrestle like a small man. He didn't shoot for doubles. He worked a body lock game, these kind of things that usually tall guys use to maximize the leverage that their height gives them. And that was Cormier's bread and butter. And the same is true in the kickboxing. It's kind of weird, too, because we have him standing very straight-legged these days, very tall. Fortunately, he can get away with it because he's shorter than most guys. But I do think that presents some problems with striking defense when you're against a jab artist like Gustafsson, who I think has one of the most educated left hands in the entire sport, not to mention the division. So
it's just a beautiful left hand.
Yeah.
Like, he mixes it up to the head and body. He does an excellent job of setting rhythm with it. So he'll tap away and probe and probe and probe, and then comes the spearing jab that hits you right in the face. He hides his right hand behind it really effectively. He doesn't telegraph his right hand at all. It's a very I would call it he throws a really natural right hand. Wouldn't you say, Connor?
Absolutely. Yeah. A really natural right hand. And one of the best things about his game to develop in recent years, he has fallen out of love with the uppercut.
Yeah.
He used to love that uppercut a little too much. And I think he's really found the right balance between that and the straight right hand. He's also developed his left hook a little more. He landed some beauties of left hooks against John Jones. So I'm happy to see his boxing game developing. I think really what this comes down to is Cormier does not have the power to take away Gustafsson's outfighting strengths the way that Rumble Johnson did, nor does he necessarily have the length to, as you said, make that margin of error for effective range as small as it was against Jones. So while Cormier absolutely could win this fight, and I think it's very close, and even Cormier should be the favorite, why not? I do think that Gustafsson's going to take it.
Yep, I come down on exactly the same side of it. I just think that there's so much more margin for error for Gustafsson here. Mm-hmm. I think that people have forgotten what a good defensive wrestler he is. And I think that there has been a lot of forgetting of how much Jones chewed up Cormier on the outside. And like, I think that's just been really forgotten. And how close Cormier kept that in close quarters. I think what people remember about that fight is Jones eating up Cormier in the clinch. But that was a really competitive fight in the clinch for 3 rounds.
Yeah.
And it was not nearly as competitive from the outside.
Yeah, and Jones is not the same kind of punishing outfighter as Gustafsson. Like, he may land more power strikes, more kicks, things like that. But when it comes to closing the distance, I think it's a little easier to do that against Jones in most cases. His distance management strikes are very committed. You aim that stomp kick for the knee, and if it misses, the guy's in. Jones lets his jab hang out there. It's not a very natural flowing punch for him. So if you slip it, perfect. You're in the clinch. You're in close. You're in short boxing range, mid-range. Gustafsson is this constant flickering, pawing jab, these slapping tight little low kicks, these flashes of uppercuts, throwing left hooks off the jab to keep you thinking about it. It's just a constant barrage of not completely powerful, but worrying strikes. And I think that's going to be a really difficult puzzle for Cormier to solve.
Yeah, to come back around to the point that to one of the points that you opened with, Connor, is that Cormier, to win this fight, has to fight against type. He has to fight against his natural inclinations and what he would like to do. Cormier is aggressive, but Cormier is not a pressure fighter, and it's mentally taxing and difficult to do that when you're getting hit over and over and over again as you come in. It's difficult when that's not your natural mode. When you would like to maybe sit back a little bit more, circle a little bit more, and throw some pot shots at range. Like, it's hard as somebody where pressuring is a tool in your toolbox and you can do it from time to time. But it's hard to make yourself do that over and over and over again when that's not your jam.
Mm-hmm. And while both men were gassed in the final round against John Jones, I think Gustafsson came off a little better than Cormier. Granted, he ate about 6 dozen head kicks in the 5th round alone and ended up getting taken down. But Cormier was all but completely uncompetitive with Jones in the final round of their bout, whereas Gustafsson still had some bursts of energy. And I don't expect Cormier to punish Gustafsson the same way that Jones did. Like I said, he doesn't have the same athletic dynamicism to land those big fight-changing strikes. It could happen. Cormier is he's not feather-fisted. I mean, we've seen him hurt heavyweights with his punches, but he's just not that same level of I'm going to shock you with something you don't expect. I'm going to throw something that you could have never seen coming and blast you out of nowhere, like John Jones and Anthony Johnson are.
Yeah, I just don't think he quite has that same thing in it. But I expect this to be really competitive. It's the matchup of the two of the best light heavyweights in the world, which at the top is as good as any other division in the sport. It's just it has no depth. Like, this is going to be an excellent fight between two fantastic fighters. We should be really excited for it. It's a worthy fight in the absence of John Jones. And maybe we'll see a big upset. It would be interesting if we did.
Absolutely. Okay, so and just in case you guys can't tell, we're already up to 54 minutes here. We're going to let today's episode run a little over the usual hour limit because we have so many good fights to discuss here. Before we wrap things up soon and move on to the final segment of the show, however, I want to talk about the co-main event. We have former welterweight champion Johnny Hendricks, who looked in the best shape of his entire career. He looked like he did back as a collegiate wrestler when he fought Matt Brown in his last fight. Really seems to have gotten his nutrition and his discipline together as a fighter. And he is fighting a guy who has always looked like that in Tyron Woodley.
This is a great fight. And Connor, you and I were talking about this off the air before we started this segment, but I really think that Tyron Woodley might be the best pure athlete in the UFC. Mm-hmm. It's either him or Yoel Romero. And Romero, which says something about Romero, given that he's 38 at this point. But I think Woodley throws one of the fastest right hands I've ever seen. He's one of the most powerful punchers I've ever seen. The basic problem in this fight is output and volume. Hendricks just throws so much more than Woodley does, and Woodley, while he's a powerful puncher, I don't think he's necessarily any more powerful than his teammate Robbie Lawler.
I think he probably is. I get the sense that he's got more ability for that one fight-ending blow than Lawler. I think Lawler's more of a concussive puncher. Woodley is like a lightning bolt.
Yeah, that's a fair distinction.
But we know Johnny Hendricks can take a shot. And the thing is that Robbie Lawler hit Johnny Hendricks a lot more than Tyron Woodley is likely to.
Yeah.
With a lot more frequency.
Yeah, barring that lightning bolt of a punch catching Hendricks at exactly the wrong spot at exactly the wrong time. To come back to our point about variance, like the chance of a single punch knocking out Johnny Hendricks seems to be fairly low at this point. Mm-hmm. Barring that outcome, Hendricks is gonna outwork him. He's just gonna take a decision with clean combination punching that has gotten better in every single fight. He's perfectly happy to stand in the pocket, block your shot, and come back with 3, 4, 5 shots of his own. He's one of the smoothest, cleanest, and most technical kickboxers in that division. As crazy as that is for the former national champion.
He has come out of nowhere to take that title, but in particular, his low kicks were astounding to me in the rematch with Robbie Lawler. As a striker, his low kicks were just so well set up. He varied them perfectly. He would constantly go inside and outside, throw them off both legs, mix in body kicks now and then, sometimes feint the kick and then come with punches. He would hide the kicks behind his punches. He was working a jab. He would work the right hook off the jab, throw what's always been a very good left uppercut just to keep Robbie Lawler standing upright and leave him in the path of those punches, leave him upright so he could have those kicks take his legs out from under him. I was really impressed with that. And what really bit Johnny in the ass in that fight was his stamina. He had this sort of dogged commitment to a wrestling game. Perhaps he was looking for rest when he was going for those takedown attempts that really never came against Robbie Lawler, but he was spending much of the fight really just kind of breathing heavily and latched onto Robbie's legs while Robbie kind of elbowed him in the ribs, and nothing really eventful happened. But when he had his fitness, when he had energy to him, and he was striking at range, he was out-striking Robbie Lawler. And not with that much difficulty. Like, Lawler had one really big rush, like classic Robbie Lawler brawler style in the first round. But second, third round, some of the crispest kickboxing I've ever seen from Johnny Hendricks, and against one of the better defensive fighters in the division.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has kind of forgotten this now, given Lawler's performance against Rory McDonald and how Lawler ended that fight with just 20 seconds of pure fury that damn near killed Johnny Hendricks and might have if the fight had continued.
Yes,
so nobody was that mad about that decision, but it was pretty unanimous among the media that Hendricks had won that fight 48-47.
Sure.
And what won it for Lawler was that. I think I counted. He threw like 37 strikes in the first minute of that fight, and then the last 20 seconds of it or so, and then he landed a front kick to the face in the second round. Those three things won that fight for Robbie Lawler, and Hendricks won almost the entirety of the rest of the fight. And then he came out and he did the same goddamn things to Matt Brown. He lit him up with combination striking, took him down pretty much at will. Johnny Hendricks is real good, folks. He's real good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the thing that I'm not sure what that accent was there at the end.
That was Johnny Hendricks.
Oh,
you know what I mean? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's Johnny Hendricks with a toothpick in his mouth, a big ass truck under his ass.
A bit nice big lipper of Copenhagen.
Yeah, absolutely, Johnny Hendricks. What a character. The thing too about Tyron Woodley is, I think it goes really. People don't really appreciate this, but Tyron Woodley is a very good defensive fighter. He is very good defensively. He has sharp awareness. He's clearly very comfortable in the pocket. He selects his counter opportunities very well. He uses parries and blocks, an increasing amount of head movement and footwork to avoid pretty much everything his opponent throws at him. The problem is that the more volume you give him, he focuses so much on picking off those shots that it starts to kill his own volume, which is never that impressive in the first place. He starts to really wait for that perfect counterpunch. But the other thing that stands out to me about this fight is Johnny Hendricks, one of the most decorated wrestlers to ever come into mixed martial arts, is not a very good mixed martial arts wrestler. I don't think he's that good, especially when you compare his statistics to someone like Tyron Woodley. Now, granted, Woodley's not been facing the same level of competition as Hendricks, but Woodley's finishing rate on takedowns is something like 90%. Hendricks' finishing rate is something like 61%. And Woodley stops something like 78% of takedowns. Hendricks stops a pretty mediocre 58% of takedowns. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Hendricks, first of all, I think that Hendricks is more of a rinse and repeat takedown artist than anything else. I think that he uses his takedowns much closer to the way that historically Frankie Edgar has, than the way that, say, George St. Pierre has used his takedowns, or the way that Tyron Woodley uses his takedowns. Like, Johnny Hendricks is looking to get a breather when he takes you down. He's going to do some work from the top.
He's scoring points. Like, in the wrestling perspective, he's scoring 2 points every time he puts you down, right?
Yeah, and I think that he's happy to wrestle. He's very hard to hold down, even though he may have gotten taken down, albeit by some of the very best wrestlers in the division, plus Rick Story in just a totally bizarre fight.
And Rick Story underrated too.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's not like he's gotten taken down by nobodies, but I think it's not the standard blast double wrestling game that we're used to seeing at 170, and Tyron Woodley has much closer to that kind of game.
Do you think it has something to do with the fact that Hendricks was a left foot forward wrestler and is a right foot forward southpaw mixed martial artist?
It could. I think that I'm not exactly sure what it is. I think that Hendricks is a better MMA wrestler than he gets credit for. I would say I think he's an above average. He's a well above average, especially offensive wrestler. I just don't think he's that worried about it. I guess would be my take. Like, and he's not real worried about holding you down. He's happy to score. He took Condit down 12 times. He wasn't really looking to stay on top of Condit, but it stopped Condit from getting any sort of rhythm in that fight. I think that's the way he uses his takedowns.
And Matt Brown too. Very smart to take a guy like Matt Brown down.
Yeah, I think it's a way of breaking the rhythm for him. It's like he hits those the way that Thai fighters hit dumps.
Sure. It's like an embarrassment, kind of. It makes you frustrated. You got to stand back up again. That's a pain in the ass. Absolutely. Yeah. I can see that. And I do think perhaps we're not measuring Johnny Hendricks' wrestling success with the right metrics. I think I wrote an article, I may have been about a year ago now. Maybe it was before he fought Matt Brown. So 6 months ago or something like that. But I talked about sort of his different style of wrestle boxing, that he's more of a clinch-oriented. The man is a vicious clinch fighter. He's brutally strong in the clinch. And that's the other interesting thing about this matchup. I think it's probably the two strongest welterweights against one another. And that alone makes it interesting. When these guys get close, what's going to happen? But Johnny Hendricks is more of a clinch fighter, more of just kind of a relentless fighter. I remember so clearly him out-muscling. And not just out-muscling, like technically just spinning George St. Pierre around, like lifting up his infant daughter and spinning him around. You know what I mean? It was like no effort whatsoever for Johnny Hendricks to just lean into his underhook and shove George St. Pierre into the fence. And no one's ever done that to George St. Pierre in the clinch. George St. Pierre is a very good clinch fighter.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the phrase country strong was invented to describe somebody like Johnny Hendricks.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. Somebody whose nutrition plan involves eating at a steakhouse that he owns.
Yeah, that was because that way he controls what he eats.
And it's just green beans and barbecue.
think about that for a second. But you know, let's hope Big Rig Steakhouse makes it out of the rough Yelp reviews it's gotten in its first month of operation.
I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, don't read them. They're not pretty.
Oh man.
But yeah, no. I mean, I think that this should, to me, be Hendricks' fight. This should be Hendricks' fight to lose. Like, all things considered, he has substantial advantages in volume. The wrestling should more or less cancel out. I would say, as an MMA wrestler, if he can tire out Woodley in the second and the third round, Woodley isn't going to hurt him while he's looking for takedowns the way that Robbie Lawler did.
Yes, absolutely. We saw that in the fight with Jake Shields, right?
Yeah.
You don't let Jake Shields pin you against the fence if you're that concerned with damaging someone while they're latched onto you.
Yeah. I think we'll see the smart, technical, tactical Johnny Hendricks we've seen when he's been at his best.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Both of us picking Johnny Hendricks. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, we're going to run through 2, maybe 3 other fights in this card, and if we have time at the very end of the show, get to some of your heavy bag questions. All of that after this. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. We got a lot of matchups to discuss here. We've decided on 4 fights that stand out the most to both Pat and myself, ones that we consider worthy of a little bit of technical breakdown. Unfortunately, that means we're not going to be able to devote a ton of time, having already passed the hour and 4-minute mark. So we are going to try and devote about 5 minutes to each of these matchups. And the first of those is Joseph Benavidez versus Ali Bagotinov, a meaningful flyweight bout. Overall thoughts on this fight, Pat?
So, again, this is one of those fights where, like the main event, you understand why the betting odds look the way that they do. Benavidez comes in as a substantial favorite. He's like minus 335 across the board as we record this. You understand why he's a 3-1 favorite, but at the same time, I see Ali Bagaudinov's path to victory really clearly. It kind of jumps out to me that Benavidez is on the wrong side of 30. He's been fighting professionally for almost a decade. He's got a lot of fights under his belt. He's always been a relatively hittable guy. He's taken good care of himself, but he's at that point now where he could start to take a turn. He's hittable. He's always been hittable. And Ali Bagautinov is one of the hardest punchers in that division. Like he may have changed his nickname to just Puncher, but he will always be the Puncher King in my heart.
I was gonna say, if Mighty Mouse can dust you, I'm damn sure the Puncher King can do it too.
Yeah, Like, I think that everybody's kind of forgotten this in the aftermath of his just drubbing at the hands of Demetrius Johnson, which, mind you, he didn't get finished in that fight, and that was 3 weeks after he'd gotten absolutely shit-kicked by Rustam Khabilov and a whole crew of other guys at Jackson's who took offense to something Bogutinov had done.
By a large lightweight in the gym.
Yeah, but like 3 of them. And
really?
Yeah, it was like it never got reported because nobody would ever go on the record to talk about it. But it's a thing that happened. Like
because Dagestanis
know about this. Yeah, but he's rawhide tough. He hits incredibly hard. Like he throws one of the hardest right hands you will ever see. And he's a really good technical fighter. He's a really good clinch fighter. He's an excellent wrestler. He's a legit World Combat Sambo champion.
Mm-hmm.
He has an outstanding top game, nice little leg lock game to boot. This is not a gimme fight for Joseph Benavidez, certainly not to the extent that the betting odds would indicate, or that it seems to be being treated as by pundits and fans.
Yeah, and it's more like Benavidez that makes me think that Bogutinov has a chance, because if we're talking classic Benavidez, I totally understand why he's so heavily favored. In that case, I see this one being very similar to Hendricks versus Woodley, right, where it's Benavidez with the defensive wrestling and with the volume. And having seen how close Bogotinov's fight with John Lineker was, I'm basically imagining a fight in which he has that kind of volume in his face and doesn't have the option of his wrestling as available to kind of slow the tide. And Lineker at the time was not a very good defensive wrestler. He was okay, but hit or miss. And he's gotten better there now, but Joseph Benavidez has always been a very stout defensive wrestler. Demetrius Johnson had a hell of a lot of trouble taking him down in their first fight until it got into the later rounds. And Demetrius Johnson's the best takedown artist in the division. And Bogutinov, solid, but he's not Demetrius Johnson. So, that being said, good defensive fighter, hard punches, good kicking game as well. Really nice high kicks from Bogutinov, pretty strong in the clinch. He may not be winning the rounds, but as far as punchers' chances go, it seems higher here than in most cases.
Yeah, I think it's fairly easy for both of us to see a scenario in which Joseph Benavidez, while winning the fight on volume, gets just dusted.
Yeah.
At some point, or gets knocked down and ends up with Ali Bogutinov on top of him for an entire round, and manages to make this a lot closer than maybe it looks on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our next matchup to discuss, one that we disagree on, Yair Rodriguez fighting Daniel Hooker, two featherweights of different levels of promise, but Hooker definitely on the tough, gritty gatekeeper side of the equation. Yair Rodriguez, obviously a very promising prospect after his incredibly impressive win over Charles Rosa at UFC 188 in front of a rabid Mexico City crowd. Now, Pat, we mentioned earlier in the show we disagree on this one. You're picking Yair Rodriguez. I fully understand why you would do so. I'm picking Daniel Hooker. Why do you think Rodriguez should be favored here?
Physicality, pure and simple. I think that he is miles beyond anything Daniel Hooker has ever experienced as in terms of athleticism and just sheer speed. Like you talked about, Rodriguez is kind of lacking boxing technique, but do you see how fast his hands come out? Like sheer hand speed makes up for a lot in terms of technique, and his kicking speed is insane. I think he's an incredibly creative fighter, and that we see that in it. We see that in his transitions. Like in one of, I think it was his fight against Leonardo Morales, or it may have been one of his fights on the Ultimate Fighter. He hit an elliptical kick to knee tap sequence that I thought was one of the coolest things I'd seen in a very long time. Like he elliptical kicked the guy in the knee, and then in just a heartbeat was in on a knee tap and took him down. And so I think that Rodriguez is kind of on the cusp of turning into something really special as a fighter. He's well trained. He seems to be picking things up very quickly. He just the physicality. Like you cannot teach those kinds of physical tools. And as durable and tough and smooth as Daniel Hooker is, as many tools as he has at his disposal, I think that just at the end of the day, you can't get past the fact that Rodriguez is just so much more physically gifted.
I agree with everything you say about his potential. I really do. I just think this is going to be that hiccup on the road to becoming a contender. I think Daniel Hooker's a very tough fighter to fight at only 6 fights into your professional career. And Pat, do you remember any examples of Yair Rodriguez's great defensive boxing ability in that fight with Leonardo Morales? Because I sure as hell do not.
He does not. He is not a particularly slick defensive fighter. He is a pure out fighter. He's either all the way out or all the way in. But he's very long. He uses his length really well, and he tries to stay out of that range. For which, respect, homie.
That is true. Got nice kicks, but I don't think he necessarily has great distance management. It's just kind of the thing I see going on here. People that most of the guys that Pantera has had the chance to fight so far have been content to kind of wait on him and hang around. They've kind of been in awe of his athleticism, if that makes any sense. Or once he starts to throw that speed out there, that crazy dynamicism, the bizarre kicks, the double jumping kicks and things, they start to hang around. Charles Rosa, Leonardo Morales, these guys are not very good pressure fighters. They are not swarmers. They don't have good jabs. They don't have distance management tools, nor do they have tools to close the gap. And Daniel Hooker does. He's got experience in kickboxing. He takes a hell of a punch, as we've mentioned several times already. And to me, I keep looking back to that fight with Maximo Blanco. I know that Maximo Blanco, he beat the, 7 shades of shit out of Dan Hooker. But Dan Hooker really showed something to me in that match, which is that the only way to trouble him consistently is with volume striking. And that is not something that Rodriguez does very well. He has great dynamicism in his strikes, but like one of the ladies we'll be talking about next, he reminds me a lot of Rose Namajunas. He doesn't necessarily put those strikes together in a consistent or intelligent way. Not yet, anyway. And he could make that leap before this fight takes place. He could have already improved that aspect of his game because he's that promising as a fighter. But Dan Hooker does. He's a very good combination puncher. He's a very dangerous clinch fighter. You put him in compromising positions, as when Ian Entwistle tried to hit him with a leg lock. And he has no problem just sitting there and pounding the hell out of you. He's also a very solid defensive wrestler. Much better than Leonardo Morales. Much better than Charles Rosa. 75% takedown defense so far in the UFC, according to the UFC statistics. Really good at scooting and cage walking, getting himself back to the fence and standing up. I don't imagine he'll spend much time grappling with Rodriguez. And if this is a kickboxing match, I kind of favor the guy with kickboxing experience. It's not that I don't see why Rodriguez is favored. I don't see why he's I don't fail to see why he's a smart pick, but I like Dan Hooker here. We'll see. It should be a good fight. I mean, I think we can agree it's going to be fun because it's hard. Dan Hooker is quickly becoming one of my favorite guys to watch.
Yeah, it's a really interesting matchup. It's a well booked fight. It's the right fight to put together if you're Sean Shelby and you're looking at this young hot shit prospect in Yair Rodriguez, it's time to kind of figure out what you got in it. And Dan Hooker is the right guy. Hooker is not ever going to break into the top 15 of the division. That's not a thing that's ever going to happen. But but imagine him like a striking Nick Lentz or something like that. That what you're going to get out of him. It's going to be competent. It's going to be well rounded, and it's going to be pretty dangerous too.
Yeah.
And it's a tightrope walk for a young, talented prospect like Yair Rodriguez, and you really get to see where he's at in his career.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the fight that I just foreshadowed a little bit. We have Angela Hill fighting Rose Namajunas. Very strange to look at both of these women as such relatively high-level contenders in the strawweight division, but both of them are. I say that because Angela Hill is only 2-1 as a professional mixed martial artist. Rose Namajunas 2-2. So we've got interestingly. Surprisingly unimpressive records by a numbers perspective, but 2 impressive fighters. Pat, you favor Namajunas, correct?
I do. I think that Hill, at this point in her career, has gotten by on athleticism, physicality, and a pretty brutalizing clinch game. And I don't think that any of those things are really going to be there for her at this point. I don't think she's as good a striker as you do. I guess I put it that way. I think that she's just not quite there. I think that if she's going to win this fight, she's going to have to beat up Rose Namajunas in the clinch. And I don't think that she's going to be able to get it there often enough, and also without the threat of the takedown. Like, I think that Namajunas can hit some takedowns. I think she's a much more dynamic grappler. I think that in terms of what she does on the feet, she's going to come out a lot calmer and a lot more centered than what we saw, than the kind of crazy shit that we saw against Carla Esparza. She's going to be a lot more meat and potatoes, and hopefully she doesn't have Pat Barry just screaming head kick in her corner. Like, you and I talked about this extensively after that fight. Like, man, did Pat Barry do her a disservice with his talk in the corner in that fight.
Well, but the thing is I also looked back, and this kind of worries me about Namajunas. I looked back, and Trevor Whitman was also asking for the head kick at points during that fight. He said, and his advice was a little better. He said, I want you to come down, I want you to feint, I want you to use lots of movement, I want you to punch the body, punch low, and then come up high with the head kick. And I think he was maybe doing that because he saw how desperately she wanted the head kick anyway. He was maybe trying to coach her without her realizing she was being coached, He's like, I know you want a head kick, do it like this. But I'm not so sure. I have a lot of respect for Trevor Whitman, but I'm not so sure that Whitman has a reputation as a guy who works with fighters like Rose Namajunas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Rose. I think
she's not Shane Carwin or Justin Gaethje.
Yeah, my thought on this is Rose Namajunas is still very much a Duke Rufus trained fighter. She is very much somebody who came out of that gym, and you see it in terms of the relatively low volume of strikes that she's thrown historically. You see it in her shot selection. You see it in her dynamism and athleticism, which are things that you get a lot of emphasis on at Rufus Sport. You see it in the way that she grapples too. She's a sprint grappler, as our good friend T.P. Grant would put it. She's somebody who's looking to explode in short bursts and finish you in short bursts on the ground, much more than somebody who's who's technically sound, who's going to kind of grind you out and look for their openings over the course of 3, 4, 5 minutes on the mat.
She's like a Joe Lozon in her submission game.
Yeah,
attacking. And Rodriguez is very similar, actually. Yair Rodriguez.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there are a lot of parallels between those two.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think that I just think that Carla Esparza is the kind of fighter who's set up very well, and so was Tisha Torres for that matter, who's set up to beat somebody like Rose Namajunas real handily. And I think that Angela Hill, who's used to being the faster fighter, who's used to being the more dynamic fighter, who's used to being the more physical fighter, is going to struggle with somebody who can match her or exceed her in those facets.
Well, I think ultimately this fight kind of comes down to volume and longevity, which is why I pick Hill here. And this is the underdog pick on this card, and I have picked plenty of underdogs because the odds are so interesting and bizarre in some places. As, for example, I don't know why Ryan Bader's an underdog over Rashad Evans, who has been out of the sport for 22 months. I don't know why Sean Jordan's an underdog, really, against Ruslan Magomedov. I think those are pretty much even fights, if not the other way around. This one I absolutely understand. And I'm not confident that Hill can beat Namajunas. I just kind of have the gut feeling, which goes against everything we were saying earlier about being probabilistic thinkers, right? The thing is I see Angela Hill as a very, very discount version of strawweight champion Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Very discount. She doesn't have the same skill set. She doesn't have the same adaptability. She's not as good in each of those areas, but her game, her metagame is very much the same. In that she strikes her opponents, she likes to apply pressure when given the chance, she mixes up kicks and punches, she's got a strong clinch game, so she punishes grapplers when they try to close the distance with her, and Namajunas is just kind of all over the place. And I may be underwriting her a little bit here, but I don't feel like I can count on the striking of Rose Namajunas, whereas at the very least, I think I know what I'm getting every time Angela Hill fights. And Namajunas, when we talked about her last time, not only did we talk about Pat Barry doing her a disservice in the corner, we also talked about the difference between footwork and movement and how Namajunas doesn't get that. And I think that that's kind of true in a lot of things. Like Namajunas is the type of fighter who will throw a flying knee and a spinning back fist and a 3-hook combination of like marching, shifting punches before she'll throw a jab cross, or before she'll throw a left hook low kick. She's not putting her strikes together in a very conventional manner. And while that makes her very surprising, I think Angela Hill's pretty composed as a fighter. I think she's pretty tough, and while I think she'll probably take kind of a beating due to that dynamism in the first round, I kind of see her pulling ahead in the later half of the fight, while Namajunas, like a lot of Rufus fighters, when she can't surprise the opponent anymore, once they get used to her bag of tricks, what bread and butter does she have to fall back on?
Yeah, there's not much. I don't disagree with any of that. I think where we kind of differ is in just how dynamic we think Rose Namajunas actually is. I tend to think she's dynamic enough to make up for that against fighters of Angela Hill's caliber. I think if she fights Tisha Torres again, Rose Namajunas is getting taken down 17 times and ground out. If she fights Joanna Jędrzejczyk, she's going to get absolutely blasted and destroyed.
Oh, no doubt.
She fights Carla Esparza again. It's probably going to look pretty similar to their first fight. If she fights Marina Moroz, I think Marina Moroz kind of takes her apart for exactly the same reasons. She fights Valerie Letourneau, I think she's in trouble. I think against Angela Hill at this stage in her career, Nami Yunus has what it takes to get that done.
You may be right, and I may be a little too wary of falling prey to the JoJo Calderwood deception once again, where we see somebody just sort of having their way with a lot of fighters really just unprepared to deal with their level of skill or their level of natural fighting ability almost. And then we see them in against, I mean, when Nami Yunus fought Tisha Torres, we saw a pretty clear difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it may not be the same. I think we can both see where each other's coming from. I'm really interested to see the fight. I think it's a fantastic matchup. And then the final fight we want to talk about, Adriano Martins versus Islam Makhachev. I love this matchup. I really do. I think it's a very interesting test for one of the guys that I consider to be one of the best prospects in the lightweight division in Islam Makhachev.
Yeah, I mean, I took my first look at Makhachev all the way back, like I said earlier, in December of 2013, and it has been just a pleasure watching him grow each and every fight since then. I mean, he is everything that I thought he could become at this point, and he's still getting better. I think what makes this such an interesting matchup is just how they literally match up with each other. That Martins is a Gleison Tebow sized lightweight, if not bigger. He's enormous, and he's a good athlete. He hits really hard. He's very fast. He's very explosive, and you know, he has the skills. He's a legit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion. Like he is a finisher on the floor, and he does so very quickly. He's a surprisingly good wrestler too, as he showed off against Rustam Khabilov. The problem is he doesn't do a whole lot. What he does is dangerous, but he just doesn't do much. You know what I mean?
No, I don't. How do you explain that?
He doesn't throw. He doesn't work at a great pace. He doesn't shoot for many takedowns. Once he gets you on the floor, he can finish. But he's not the kind of guy who's going to come out and shoot a whole bunch of takedowns. What he does is very deliberate. It's a very slow pace. Like there were a lot of times he would go 30, 45 seconds, a whole minute without throwing a strike against Rustam Khabilov. Even while he got 2 takedowns in that fight, I think he only shot 4 in the entire 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's true. And the Adriano Martins fight that stands out in my memory, even though it was one that he lost, is his fight with Donald Cerrone. I think it was one of his better performances, actually. I know he got head kicked into oblivion and beyond in the first round, but up until that point, he was doing a really nice job of outboxing Donald Cerrone off the back foot. And I think it kind of showed off an underrated striking game that we have not really been able to see. And it was also one of his better fights in terms of volume, where he was putting together combinations relatively nicely. He was throwing enough volume out there to make Cerrone wary about walking into him. He was counterpunching pretty well. But I do agree with you. As far as volume fighting goes, he's definitely not top of the line, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think his striking gets a little bit underrated because he looks stiff as he throws. He looks stiff, and it seems kind of inefficient, and I think it probably is stiff and pretty
like
inefficient.
He muscles his punches through a little bit.
Yeah, but what you can't argue with is his timing or his power.
Absolutely.
I mean, he melted Juan Manuel Puig, just melted him.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was a vicious plastering. And you could see his power got Khabilov thinking. Khabilov is a tough dude who has taken big shots from other fighters, and his power had Khabilov thinking. Like,
absolutely.
There's a lot to worry about there. But the difference to me here is just the sheer quality of the wrestling game. Like Makhachev is one of the like Khabib, very, very similar kind of style, like non-stop style. Once he gets his hands on you, once he grabs you, you're going to go down, and you're not going to get up for a while. Even if you're a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion, I think it's going to be really, really hard for Martins to find space to escape or a space to get to the kind of positions that he wants to be in. Just a constant stream of misdirection trips, throws, shot takedowns, and then seamless transitions to rides and top position.
Yeah, I mean, you might think you're about to get up. That's the thing with Nurmagomedov and with Makhachev. You might think you're about to stand up, but you're really only walking into another position which the Sambist wanted you to walk into. You know, it's a very, very attritive style in that I think these guys from this school, Khabib and his brother,
Abu Bakr.
Abu Bakr, that's right. I keep wanting to say his father's name. And Makhachev, these guys are incredibly effective in wearing down their opponents mentally, just constantly putting them through this struggle. Like, you just have to struggle even to just get back into the fight. You have to struggle to get into a position where you can feel like you can start winning the fight. You're not even struggling to start winning the fight, you know what I mean? You're struggling to set up to win the fight. And constantly just trying to work your way back to your feet. And meanwhile, these guys are just transitioning from position to position, landing strikes in those transitions. I think the one thing that stands out about Makhachev and why I think I actually enjoy watching him fight a little more than his teammates is his clinch game. Where Nurmagomedov is much more of a takedown artist. He likes his double legs. He likes his shot takedowns, his single legs. He has his interesting throws. He's happy to spend a lot of time on the ground, where I love watching Makhachev set those takedowns up and mix them in with strikes in the clinch. I think he is a phenomenal infighter on the feet, working between specifically like collar tie uppercuts. He'll hit collar tie uppercuts, and then while you start to cover, he'll turn that collar tie into a quick whizzer and hit a hip toss, or he'll get you to stand up and then shoot in on your hips. I just think all of that is so fascinating to watch. You can really see the gears turning when he's putting his strikes and his takedown attempts together in that close range when the other guy really feels that pressure.
Yeah, he's a really gorgeous transitional fighter, even more so than Khabib, who is an excellent transitional fighter in his own right. And I think Abu Bakr is a pretty fantastic transitional fighter as well. Yeah. But I think Makhachev, more than any of those guys, feels the flow of it.
Yes, because Nurmagomedov forces things. He's very good at forcing things. It's very difficult to if he wants you to go down, you're going to go down. And that is its own kind of domination.
He's such a potent physical specimen, Nurmagomedov is.
Yes.
In a way that I don't, and what gives me a little pause about this matchup and maybe Makhachev's ceiling in general, I think he's become a better athlete since he's gone to AKA and he's gotten on a legit world-class strength and conditioning program. But he's not, I don't think that Makhachev is a top 5 physical specimen in the way that Khabib is.
Yeah.
And so, I think he needs to be a little craftier about those things, and luckily he is.
And that's exactly it, right? Where Nurmagomedov will force things, and he can. Makhachev takes what you give him, and he will trick you into thinking that you're not giving him anything.
Yeah, precisely. That's a perfect way to put it. But so, while I think this is a tough matchup for Makhachev, it's the right one for him where he's at in his career. He's definitely on the fast track. They're not giving him any softballs here.
No.
After that first one. But I think he's ready for this. I think he grinds out Martins, wears him down, maybe finishes late, but more likely kind of takes just a dominating decision from him.
Only 24 too. I did not even realize how young Makhachev was.
He's only been fighting professionally for I think 3.5 or 4 years.
That is the most bananas thing about this entire discussion. This man was born after me. He's doing things I could never dream of doing. He was born a full year after me.
Also, a strong Instagram game from Islam Makhachev.
Yeah, we have to point out that if you guys want to just see a window into a world that you could never imagine for yourself, unless you happen to be Dagestani, you should check out the Instagram game of the many Dagestani fighters who have begun to invade the ranks of the UFC in recent years. Pat pointed out to me, for some reason, these guys don't tweet. They don't go on Facebook. But they're all on Instagram all the time. Why do you think that is?
I mean, they love V-Contacte, and they love Instagram. And I honestly don't know. I think it's because they've never had computers. They've only ever had smartphones. They do. And I think it's a form of sociability for them. But that we don't, at the risk of getting into the cultural dynamics of the North Caucasus.
Sociological discussion. But if you want to see some really cool training clips, as well as a lot of pictures of grim-looking men in tracksuits in front of dusty mountains, check out Islam Makhachev and Ali Bagotinov on Instagram. What was the highlight of Bagotinov's Instagram posting this week?
Oh my God, I can't believe we forgot to mention this as we were discussing that fight. A video of him hitting pads, looking really good hitting pads with his boxing coach, with the caption, "Remember the punches, Joseph." No
comma, no real context. I'm not sure why he thinks Joseph Benavidez would not remember the punches, but I'm so happy that he felt the need to remind him.
That video is my everything. I just love it. Love everything about it.
Absolutely. So, Pat, do you have anything coming out this week before we wrap things up?
I do, actually. Yeah, I have my preview coming out tomorrow on Bleacher Report. They're now branded as the complete guides to whatever the event is, and then I'm actually gonna interview Dominic Cruz tomorrow. We're gonna have a little chat about UFC 192 and what he sees happening there, and that should be out. I want to say probably Thursday.
Lovely, looking forward to that. As for me, I think I'm going to be writing about Alexander Gustafsson's wrestling and his takedown defense throughout fighting. So I'm looking forward to writing about that. I may write a thing about Adrian Broner if I have time, but I will be busy also transcribing a past episode of Heavy Hands that all of you should check out if you haven't heard it already. We had an interview with Tyron Woodley a few weeks back, the man fighting Johnny Hendricks this week. Just a stupendous interview. Absolutely a guy I'd love to talk to again. Both Pat and I really enjoyed it. He's intelligent. He's very self-aware. And also funny, and he had some insulting things to say about Johnny Hendricks.
It was just outstanding.
He's a baby Johnny Hendricks, I believe, were his words.
Yeah, a whiny baby.
A big
whiny
baby
Johnny Hendricks.
So you guys should check that out. Get a little hype in your veins for this excellent fight card, as if you need any more, because as Pat and I have intimated many times throughout today's discussion, we're really looking forward to this one. Apologies that we didn't get to the heavy bag questions this week. We're already at an hour and a half over that, in fact. So we're going to have to wrap things up. We'll try to get to some of the good questions we got this week for next week's episode when we are recapping what will hopefully be a very memorable event. If you do want to send questions to us, or if you have other comments or suggestions, easiest way to do that is on Twitter. You can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman on that medium, and I am at BoxingBush, B-U-S-C-H is how that's spelled. My name is Rebush, that's why. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.